And hello again, and in this video we're going to make a start on reassembling this, my Kawasaki GPz 750 engine. So as you can see, I've just loosely assembled it. Right now there's nothing inside the engine, no crank, no pistons, no gearbox and so on. But I've just put it all together to show how it looks now it's been recoated with the high-tech ceramic coating. This coating is a bit like Cerakote, except this particular coating aids in heat dispersal. And that was done by a local company called Camcoat. And it all looks pretty damn good. But one problem with having an engine coated like this is that beforehand, of course, they have to blast it to get rid of all the old paint and the old finish. When they blast it, it leaves behind the blasting medium, the grit, the sand, or whatever they happen to use, and that gets in oil, that gets in all the oil galleries, all the nooks and crannies in the engine. And it is essential that we remove every last bit of grain of sand, a little bit of grit that's left behind after the coating process. So we use an airline for that, high pressure air, and for the bottom end it's not such a problem. But in this particular case, for the cylinder head, it is a bit of a problem. And that problem is that there are 4 oil galleries which run through the cylinder head, which feed the cams, and they come up from, it all comes up from the bottom end through the block into the cylinder head. And the problem is that there is a bit of a dead space on each end of those galleries. Now, when Kawasaki made the cylinder head, and like all other Kawasaki cylinder heads of the era, they actually line drill the galleries all the way through from one side to the other. They then block off each end of those oil galleries with a little aluminium plug, and that's the sort of secret we have to deal with. So what we've done is we removed those little plugs, pull them out, drilled and pull them out to get access to this dead area here and here and here and here. We can then blast out the area, make sure there's no grit, no sand left behind in there. But then of course we then have to block off those oil galleries again. And to do that, what we've done is we've made new plugs which have been pressed into place here and here. In fact, I'll just zoom in now, we can see what's going on. And so here are the ends of the oil galleries which have now been plugged. So for the bigger one we used an aluminium plug which we had to machine up. For the smaller one we just used an 8mm stainless steel grub screw, which meant we had to thread this area as well, but not such a big problem. So with that done, the cylinder head is now clean and we know we won't have a problem going forward. And so, I've not yet started to reassemble the bottom end. I have started to do some work on the cylinder head. So let's take off this cam cover, just lifts off like that. And first of all, I think you can see I've now fitted new exhaust stubs here. This is stainless steel. I've also refitted all the valves. And before I did that, I lapped the valves into the cylinder head. Now, as it turns out, these valves were in excellent condition, and it actually didn't really need doing, I don't think, because I checked them with a magnifying glass and they all look in pretty good condition. But I still did a little bit of work on there, maybe just 30 seconds with some fine lapping paste, and that was really all it needed. So let me now remove this cylinder head. And so to lap in the valves, it's actually really simple. All you need to do is put a valve in, no springs or anything like that, and then use this little tool here, little suction on it. You stick it on the end of the valve and then do this to spin the valve in its seat. And before you do that, you add a bit of this stuff. This is lapping paste. This is quite a cool little old-fashioned container because it's got 2 lids. On one end it's fine paste, on the other end it's coarse paste, which I think is quite clever. I guess it must be a really old design. So yeah, grinding paste, you just need a little bit of it. Let me just take that off there if I can show you what it's like. Come on, there we go. So there it is, it's just like a sort of paste, a bit gritty, and just put a little bit of that on the contact patch between the valve seat and the cylinder head, and just do that for a little while and you can feel it getting smoother, and lift it up a little bit, do that 30 seconds, maybe a minute, that's all it needs, clean it all off, then apply the same thing with the fine, and that's it. As I say, mine were in really good condition, so I actually don't think this cylinder head and this engine's done that much in terms of mileage. Either that or it's been well cared for. Just a little bit of coke on the valves, but not too much. So again, it all indicates that this particular engine hasn't done a huge mileage, which is good news. So here we have a bucket that slides into here like that, and underneath the bucket we have a shim like that. See there? And that sits on top of the valve in a little hollow, just like that. And then the bucket sits on top of there. And that's okay, but the problem is, to change that shim, you've got to remove the cams to access the damn shim, which means removing the bucket. In comparison, here is a bucket from a bigger Z1, Z1000, Z900 and so on, and it has a much bigger shim that sits on top of the bucket. You see the difference? There's a 650, 750, and there's a Z1, Z900 and so on. And so that means that if you want to change a shim, to change the valve clearance of a bigger Z1, Z1000, Z900, you don't have to remove the cams to do it. You can actually just take them out with a special tool, ease them out and change them over without problem. So the reason why Kawasaki changed over to this method is because, first of all, it's a bit lighter, but also there is a danger at very high revs or with performance cams that on the bigger Zs they can spit out a shim. It can get pulled out and then that will wreck your engine, whereas with this way it can't. It just means it makes life more complicated and more time consuming when you want to reshim the valves. That's something I've got to do in the future. I'm not looking forward to it, but yeah, we'll get there in the end. One thing actually I've got to do is I've got to measure all of these shims to make sure I know how thick they are. Originally they would have been stamped with a little number to tell you how thick they were, but that's long ago rubbed off, so I've got to measure them all, take a careful note, and then I'll know what shims I've got in the cylinder head when I first put the cams in. Then I've got to measure the valve clearances. As I say, chances are some will be okay and some won't be. The ones that aren't, I then need to remove the cams, remove the shims that aren't right, and replace them with the appropriate shim to give me the correct valve clearance. You can buy shims from Kawasaki. You can often get them second-hand online. Thankfully, my mate Les is a bike mechanic, and he's got a little bag of these shims, so hopefully when I've got the few that I need to change, I can take those to him and we'll do a swap. I'll give him the ones I don't need and he'll give me the ones I do need, and hopefully that'll be all the valves shimmed correctly. And so next I need to spend many hours cleaning up all the mating surfaces on the cases, because right now they've still got bits of gasket material stuck on there that I've got to scrape off, clean it up and get it as clean as I possibly can get it before we start to rebuild the engine. Let's have a look now. The crank, turns out it's in excellent condition, no problems at all. The bores are fine, but I've got to measure the ring gaps, make sure the rings on the pistons are okay, but something tells me they will be okay, because everything I'm looking at on this engine, it's in excellent condition. There's no hardly any wear at all, and I do suspect that this engine hasn't done many miles. Now the history of this engine was that it was put into a Kawasaki Z50 back in the early 90s, and I know that the bike hasn't moved since 2000. So how many miles it did before then, we don't know, but I suspect it's not very many, which is great news for me. What I will also do is I need to rebuild the starter clutch, the sprag clutch, because why not? The thing's out in the open, it's much easier to rebuild it rather than when it's been in the engine, because I have found out you can rebuild them, or rather take them out. The sprag clutch can be removed from the engine even when it's in the bike, but it's very, very difficult to do. You need to remove the sump and then lean the bike right over to access it, and it's just like really difficult to do, so I really don't want to do that. So belt and braces, I'll rebuild it while it's out in the open and much easier to work with. The transmission had a problem with my transmission because the splines on the output shaft, which the sprocket goes onto, was badly fretted and worn, so I can't use that. So I found out, in fact, I got a comment on YouTube that said, why not fit the transmission from a ZR7S, which is a later model of this particular engine. The reason being that the output shaft, which holds the sprocket, is a bit longer than on these engines, and that makes my life a lot easier when it comes to fitting a back wheel, a wider back wheel, a 180 back wheel. It means lining up the rear chain is much easier if you've got a longer output shaft. So that was a good call, and so I've now bought myself a complete transmission from a ZR7S. Actually, it wasn't too expensive. I think it's about £80–90. I guess there's not much demand for those sort of things, so the price, isn't too bad. Seems to be in excellent condition, and being one of the last versions of this engine, I guess it's it's much less worn than you might find on a 750 or 650 from the late 70s, early 80s. Yeah, so I've got to do that. I've got to shim out the damn valves, of course, refit the cams and so on. Now the pistons, again, look in good condition. The bores are in excellent condition. No obvious scores, marks, chips. You can't feel any ridges anywhere. Yeah, it all looks like this engine's not done a lot of miles, which is great news for me. So, where to start? Well, I'm not going to spend, as I say, many hours cleaning up the mating surfaces of these cases. Look, there's a bit here I'm looking at. A bit of old gasket material. When I've done that, and I'm happy that it's as clean as I can get it, I'll make a start by fitting the crank with new seals and the conrods and so on. I'll then fit my transmission and everything else in the bottom end, and hopefully by the end of this video the bottom end will be together, and so we'll rejoin the video when I've done all that work and I'm about to fit the crank for the first time. And now, after many hours of scraping the gasket surfaces with a blade from a Stanley knife and chasing out all the threaded holes, I'm now finally at the point where I can begin the build of the engine. And so we'll begin by fitting the crankshaft shell bearings. There's the first one there. Here's number 2, which of course I have labelled 1, 2. So that's B1, B2. Here's B3, and so on, just clicks in like so. And now we'll repeat the process, but this time for the upper crankcase. Because it's upside down, T1 has to go on the right hand side, not the left hand side. So there's T1. Next up, T2, and of course you want to keep them in line because this is shell bearings which have worn alongside the crankshaft, so you want to make sure you keep them where they came from. And next, before I fit the crank, I'm going to use this stuff, assembly lube, on the shell bearings just to protect them in those first few seconds before the oil can circulate around the freshly built engine. So I'll put plenty on there, and that should hopefully protect, as I say, the shell bearings in those first few seconds. And next I've just pushed on new oil seals on each end of the crank. They just slide on, and they are actually different sizes, so it's pretty easy to work out which one's which. And next I need to fit the new high-vol chain and a new cam chain, so that should be pretty easy. Just slide it on. I'm supposed to be able to get this on it. There we go. There we go. Whew. Right, so that's the high-vol chain on. Next, the new cam chain. Should be a bit easier. Just loop him on. Like so. we go. A bit tricky doing it all on your own. Come on. So the cam chain goes like so. So there's the cam chain on, high-vol chain on. So now this crank can go back in the case. Cam chain goes down like that, and he goes like that. Right, I think that's okay. Make sure that seems okay. Just move it out of the way for the time being. Right, so let's see what's next. And next is to fit this idler gear, which goes something like that, with a pin which goes through there. However, this gear is not symmetrical side to side, as you can see, and it has to go in the correct way, either that way or that way, and I can't remember which one it is. So first I've got to go and check the manual and make sure I get that right. And so I did find a very blurry black and white photograph in the factory manual showing how this cog fits into the cases. So now with that done, it's time to move on. And so moving on then to the transmission, and here we have the gearbox components. So overall it all looks pretty good, except for we do have a little bit of wear here. They engage like so, and so they can wear quite a lot here. They're not too bad, but I have seen better. The big problem though is here. So this is the output shaft, and here these splines hold the sprocket which drives the chain, and these look pretty damn worn. Perhaps because the sprocket became loose and it chattered, which has worn away the splines, or it could be, which I've been told, that the rear wheel fitted on the bike that this engine came out of didn't have a cush drive, so that gave these splines a hard time. Anyway, let me zoom in and I'll show you the problem. And so I've now zoomed in as much as I can do. I'm not sure you can tell from the pictures, but this area here is really worn. There's a step here and a step here, which there shouldn't be, because that's where the sprocket had been fretting and wearing away these splines. And so therefore, I don't want to use this particular gearbox or this particular output shaft in the build. And so to refit the input shaft and output shaft back in a crankcase is really simple. Just drop straight in without any problems. And since I've got the old output shaft from the GPz motor and the new output shaft from the ZR7S motor, I thought I'd do a comparison, a sort of side by side. And sure enough, the output shaft here on the new transmission is a lot longer than that of the original. I'm not sure how much longer. I'd say about maybe 12-13 millimeters longer, and that'll be very helpful when it comes to getting the chain alignment right when I'm fitting a much wider 180 rear tyre. So I thought it's quite a nice comparison. I've also noticed that there's quite a lot of corrosion here on this bush. This bit is obviously on the outside of the engine, this bit is on the inside, and in the middle we've got the seal, and there you can see quite a lot of wear and corrosion. You've also got a groove there. Don't think that's original, but perhaps it is, I don't know. I'll have to check the manual. But if I can, I'm going to replace this particular bush with a new one. Not sure if they're available, but hopefully they will be. And so next I need to work on the sprag clutch for the starter, and of course the gear selector mechanism. But that will have to wait because I'm currently waiting for some new bearings to arrive for that area of the engine. And so for now then, that's it for this particular episode. So thanks for watching, and cheers.